For many of us, psychology focuses on the individual experience, such as our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But liberation psychology flips that script. It asks, how do social structures, oppression, and injustices impact our mental well being? How might we explore a client's struggle within the context of classism, racism, sexism, and other forms of social injustice? And where does our critical consciousness come into play if we truly want to help ourselves, our clients, and the field of psychology move in a direction of equity and liberation? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zen. Today we have a returning guest, Dr. Báez-Powell, a licensed psychologist in Virginia and Washington, a PsyPact provider, and offers mental health services in English, Spanish, and American Sign Language. Dr. Báez-Powell has held clinical positions as a staff psychologist and diversity and inclusion psychologist, was a faculty at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and recipient of the Early Career Award for Distinguished Practice Contributions to the Advancement of Psychotherapy in the year 2023, which was awarded through APA's Division 29. Dr. Báez-Powell also has 2 published articles in the year 2023, which addresses racism in the therapeutic context. The first article is entitled Ramifications of Clients' Use of Projective Identification, Racism, and Enactment of Otherness, a nascent clinician's struggle inhabiting her identities in the therapy room. The second article is titled Decolonizing My Therapeutic Identity, Going Beyond the Surface. As a Latinx psychologist, Dr. Báez-Powell will be talking about liberation psychology and how to apply its central ideas in our everyday practice as mental health providers. Dr. Báez-Powell, thank you so much for returning to our show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Now, we actually spoke offline after our previous episode and thought it would be helpful for folks to have more information about liberation psychology. So why don't you share with me your thoughts on what is liberation psychology for you?
Absolutely. I find it really important to talk about the roots of liberation psychology before we kind of talk about the practice of decolonial therapy. And so for me, it's important to name, right, at its most basic definition, liberation psychology really are psychological approaches that aim to understand and address oppression in individual and groups. And so that's helpful to kind of ground ourselves within. It really comes and rises from emancipatory movements in Latin America, really highlighting the work of Paulo Freire in Brazil and Ignacio Martín Barró in El Salvador, with a focus really on psychological and systemic impacts of oppression, discrimination, and inequality, and uses this to approach case conceptualization and treatment planning, moving really away from over-pathologizing or this overemphasis on diagnostics to work with people. And this is super important because really it takes into account people's lived experience and the sociopolitical positioning of themselves and their identities and the impact that this has. It's also important for me to talk about liberation psychology being a reaction to dominant Eurocentric psychology and the limitations that it has in being able to work within activism when it comes to holistic and collective care. And liberation psychology really comes through in aiming to expand dominant psychology to reflect the reality of the shifting population. When we center it this way, it kind of opens the door for a lot of that conversation, right? And to be able to talk about the shifting population and mindset here within the United States. So we also see a rise in the United States of liberation psychology post 2016 elections, right? We're in that mask of neutrality across professions really started to collapse in the face of the country's political polarity.
Yeah, yeah. And when I was reading up on liberation psychology, it was so fascinating to learn that it actually originated from Latin America.
Hmm.
And these certain ideas and philosophy, I love it. It's like, hey, we need to decenter the Eurocentric approach. And I think it's very challenging. I'm maybe speaking on behalf of just my course of development and learning therapy, how when we're taught basic psychotherapy principles, even just diagnostics, even theories, we don't really think about who the population is really for. And
Hmm.
oftentimes it's assumed like this is the way, and we don't think
Hmm.
about this changing population that you're referring to.
Absolutely. And, I really love using the language, right? The liberation psychology aims to expand, right? To reflect that reality of our shifting population, because right now it really feels like we are in need of such collective healing that we need coming out of COVID-19, living through anti-trans, anti-immigration, and anti-feminist legislation, considering the continuous trauma of indigenous lives and conversations about land back, right? As well as, the rising awareness across the United States of genocide, occupation, and the impact of Western imperialism across the globe. We need to be able to meet those demands because the conversation is there.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It's like a very activist approach that I embody a philosophy of life. And
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So, and why don't you tell me a little bit more about, what you would like listeners to understand more deeply about liberation psychology? Because I think most folks are thinking, well, sure, I understand the concept of it. How do I apply this in everyday practice?
Certainly. So I think that's something I'd like listeners to be thinking about is really this emphasis on decentering problems within the person and looking at the person's strengths, affirming cultural values, and promoting that collective and systemic healing and change to reduce human suffering. I think that is at the center of the tenets of liberation psychology. Really brings into question how people are taught to think about diagnostics and the historical roots of diagnosis and the discrimination within the mental health field that I think we really need to challenge, and that liberation psychology is maybe the theory and guidelines. Decolonial
Hmm.
therapy we might think of as the practice and the action oriented way that we embody this. And that really translates into politicizing your practice. So for me, this means, right, an emphasis on identity and social cultural positioning and its impact, meaning moving away from pathologizing into collective wellness and healing, destigmatizing trauma, centering the problem, firmly within the system that is responsible for harm and introduction of harm, right? Connection to ancestry and land, validating sociopolitical history, in reality, right, to prevent any gaslighting and introjection of biases and harm. And we really see a lot of changes in being able to name the stress in this way because it helps resist some of those feelings of shame, blame, and guilt that our BIPOC community can really experience in, holding positions of power or just really existing within our system. And I find that practicing this can really help redirect energy towards healing, community, and activism because it shifts the question from what is wrong with me
Hmm.
to what's wrong with my environment and what can I do about it. And so it shifts the lens from this individual, right, problem, if we want to call it that way, into what I can do at a more collective scale. And that's going to impact much more of my healing, but more of my presence in my community.
Hmm. There's more involvement too as you're describing this on behalf of the client. Because if the client is considering this idea of collectivist approach to healing, it in many ways requires them to be involved in a community, to engage and connect and figure out what identity, what um, processes, what activities resonate with me, and also to ask the question, well, why do I think I'm anxious? Maybe something happened and I feel anxious about it, going beyond more of a I feel anxious. Wait, what are the circumstances that would normally make anyone anxious in this situation? Maybe this is a history of learned behavior that's been reinforced by whatever means, by whatever the environment has produced. So I also appreciate that you mentioned liberation psychology is like the philosophy, and then you said decolonial. What's the word? I don't have the word correctly.
Decolonial therapy.
Decolonial therapy. So that's a new term for me. Can you describe decolonial therapy and maybe provide some specific examples? Again, how we as clinicians can apply that in everyday practice.
Definitely. So for me, decolonial therapy is not necessarily different from liberation psychology. So for me, it's that I've gone through the process of, the language that we hear a lot alongside liberation psychology is decolonizing therapy, right? So even my paper, right, decolonizing my therapeutic identity. For me, practicing decolonial therapy represents that I've done the very deep work of challenging what I've been taught, challenging how I've been socialized towards my own identities and other identities. And from there, I apply that work that I've done within myself and my practice is that, I show up as a therapist holding all of those identities, and it brings into context how I experience things, how other people experience me and what I'm saying, right? My own approaches to healing and living, really rooted in some ancestry work with music and dance. I'm from the Dominican Republic. Those things are super important culturally, as well as food and other things. And I make sure that I educate myself in how some of the things are represented in society, right? So part of it for me is approaching therapy from this holistic point of view. Positioning, I have clients that often come in with either first or second generation immigrants, predominantly queer BIPOC clients. And often when they come into therapy, they come in with I feel really stressed. This is what I'm doing at work. This is what I'm doing in my personal life. I feel like I can't do it all. And I feel it's so important for me, if they haven't named it themselves, for me to be able to name, right? We live within a capitalist society that is also ableist and misogynistic, right? And embedded in white supremacy and patriarchy. And shifting the conversation into the reality is that you can't do it all.
Wow, for you to name the inequities that a client experiences, that demonstrates how we need to do our own level of work so we ourselves can be comfortable addressing it with our clients. And so I would imagine that it will also create a space for the clients to examine these issues with you in a session and how that might relate to the issues that actually brought them in the first place.
Absolutely. That is my reality. That is your reality. And there are powerful forces at work to keep us separated from that reality. And in not inhabiting, right, that, gaslighting, I am reinforcing anyone's power and empowerment to be able to name it for themselves. And this is a little bit of what we mean by shifting the problem from, right, there's a deficiency within the person that can't do this, right, can't meet their goals that they have for themselves or that have been set up for them, into let's see the context that you're living within and see if that's even realistic. So when clients do come in and they say, this is the type of job I have, I'm trying to cook at home, I'm trying to exercise, I'm trying to spend time with family and community and all these things, and I find myself failing over and over again, right? Rooting us within this context allows us to move away from, you're not failing from doing these things, but our system is currently set up to not support you in achieving a lot of those things, right? Our system is not set up to be supportive of wellness and healing and connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And I couldn't agree more. As a parent, you know, we rely so much on this idea that it takes a village. What
Mhm.
village? We're not building villages. We don't have systems setting ourselves up to create those villages. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I feel like I also have a unique perspective of that and being an immigrant myself, because I grew up in the Dominican Republic until mid to late teenage years. And now, right, I'm living in the United States. I've been living here for about 15 years or so. And I can see the disparity. I've found myself in those positions that I see my clients find themselves within. But also, I hold that reality that sometimes, previously has been easy to deny, which is there's so much community, right? There's someone helping you cook, or there might be someone helping you with childcare. There might be, right? Like you see your community so often. I think recently I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about family and this language in the United States about extended family, not nuclear family. And I have such a hard time with that language because my family is my family. And I grew up weekly seeing my cousins. And I come from a family of like 70 people deep amongst uncles, aunts, and cousins, right? And there was always support. There was always community coming together. I always remember, right, if something happened challenging in my family, I would quickly be taken out of school and go to one of my cousin's my cousin's houses, and I would stay there for a day or two or a weekend, and we were just in community as things happened. I don't see that so much here in the United States.
It's so beautiful just thinking about that connection. And then, of course, in contrast to the United States, where it feels very lonely. And rightfully so, because it's the hyper individualistic society that if you're hyper individualistic, it's going to basically launch you to the space of isolation and loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So for you, what does it mean to be a Latinx psychologist?
Absolutely. I think I said this a little bit last time when I was here, that my identities really give context to my approach to living and my practice of therapy in ways that feel really culturally affirming. And I find a lot of power in just being able to name my identities. I am a light-skinned Latinx immigrant of Afro-Latinx descent from a colonized Caribbean country that holds collectivistic ideals. I am a queer cisgender woman, raised culturally Catholic, currently agnostic. I have lived in varying points of socioeconomic status and political and individual trauma, and I live with invisible health disabilities. For me, it just feels so empowering to be able to come into conversations within the profession, as this is who I am. This is what it means for me to inhabit those identities. This is, where I'm politically localized or sociopolitically localized. It will always be a part of my practice, and it needs to be a part of my identity as a therapist. And so the naming this also influences the way, right, that people approach taking information from me, how I take others in, my approaches to holistic and collective healing. And it's pretty powerful in how my identities also feel like they hold a history of resilience, resisting shame, and resisting projections, and just that naming of who I am and where I come from.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting because as you're naming what it means for you to be a Latinx psychologist, from all the different identities that you've described, it also creates an interaction, as you mentioned, which is when you're showing up in therapy, you're thinking about, your identity and how others respond to you. And so when you're going into session thinking about this and naming it, making it clear, you're also inviting your clients to engage in that conversation and respond with you. Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I feel like, there's a lot of therapists that believe to keep it separate. I practice relational psychodynamic therapy. So for me, at any point, if any parts of my identity are named or come through in some way, right, then for me, it always just feels like it goes back to being able to have a conversation about it within the relationship. So for example, I mentioned, right, I have invisible health disabilities that present themselves. That can't be absent of who I am as a therapist because it is going to directly impact my clients and their scheduling, right? And some of the intersections that you might, right? Like I name some of these things at the beginning of therapy, not all those things, but one that I do usually name is the health disabilities because I want to make sure that they're consenting to working with me, someone who might have more of a restricted schedule. And they need to be a part of that conversation with me because it will intersect with how they show up. Part of being in relational psychodynamic therapy, right, is inviting a lot of those relational dynamics that, people grow up within and their current patterns of relationship. If someone has, for example, any caregiving trauma or any deep loss, any instances of being caregivers to their parents for one reason or another, any history of neglect or abandonment, in those moments where I might have to abruptly cancel, they may experience me that way. It needs to be a part of the conversation so that when those instances do happen, they are still towards the, let's call it promotion of healing rather than reenacting harm without a conversation being present. And it gives us
Mm.
a lot of information, right? Like how my clients react to me being absent for a week or however long. It does give us information around their relationship patterns. And so I just find that some of these things, even if I tried, let's say, to not have it present itself, will be a reality of working with me.
Yeah. And it's interesting because this is also, for me, maybe diagnostic isn't the right word because we're not diagnosing, but it's more data. And as you were describing, if this person is responding to you in certain ways, we're also thinking about how they respond to other relationships. And that is information to work with in therapy. As we've been exploring liberation psychology, I almost forgot to ask, can you share with me specific moments in your life that led you to pursue this specific area within psychology?
That is such an important question. And there's three, memories that come to mind during my training that really exemplify how I shifted and kind of moved towards liberation psychology as, you know, adding to what I was already learning in my psychodynamic program. Part of it is understanding that when I first moved to the United States, immigration in itself is, pretty traumatic in itself. And I think that entering grad school gave me an opportunity to start opening the door to what some of those experiences really look like and be able to give a voice to and be in touch with that reality versus, up until that point, everything that I'd internalized around my identities. So growing up, you see in movies and you're taught and socialized that the United States is, I think, a lot of the words that used to be used before is it's a melting pot, it's the land of opportunity. It is, I was queer, and during that time, not knowing necessarily what that would look like within my own society, and you see all this TV around acceptance or LGBTQ acceptance. And when I got to the United States, I definitely had to go through some deep disappointment and face the reality that that is not necessarily what the United States represented or the reality of the United States. I was bullied and aggressed upon for having an accent or my English, also for the way my appearance and my body being different. I also found it challenging, right, within where I was living. Wasn't really an opportunity to come out as queer. And so I really experienced all of those things that came together. And so in grad school, right, we're kind of opening up some of those areas as we were learning and really starting to develop our identities as therapists. And a couple of things came together while I was doing that kind of exploration. One of them is I started co-leading a group that was specifically for gay older men who'd lived through the AIDS epidemic. And I started doing some psychological testing, predominantly psychoeducation in bilingual schools. And the supervisors I was seeing were predominantly white supervisors. And I imagine, a lot of psychologists in training have this experience of all of a sudden you have this voice inside of you, and they're the supervisors that you're seeing and how they're guiding you. And over time, it built to a very white, Eurocentric, dominant psychology voice. So there was a year where I entered clinical training at an HBCU college counseling center, and my supervisor was a Black woman. And I talk about this actually in my paper, Decolonizing My Therapeutic Identity, because it was so difficult sometimes to take in what she was teaching me with this already developed kind of white supervisory voice. So she kept bringing in be yourself, let's bring more of you into the therapy room. How can you be present both, physically and mentally within the identities that you hold? As Latinx, we respect authority figures. So I wasn't necessarily resisting, but I was definitely in panic mode of, I don't know how to do this. How do you do this? What do you mean? Because up to that point, I had learned a lot of the opposite. So that experience really started opening up, right? There are so many parts of me that I'm not allowing to enter the space. And this was, added on and maybe became more of a visual with the second memory, which is the end of my second year of clinical training. The person who later became my mentor and my supervisor during my postdoctoral year walked in, and she is a Lebanese woman with very curly hair. And she walked in as an adjunct faculty and introduced herself. And I just started crying because within my program, I felt like there were very explicit standards of professionalism, and my hair tends to be, on the spectrum of wavy and curly. And I think because I grew up, right, blow drying and straightening it so much, some areas have more flat areas. But I would either go into my program Monday through Friday with my hair blow dried or up in a bun. And every Friday, I took my peers out dancing Latinx music in DC, and immediately I would let my curls out. And this is a woman walking into the program very confidently with her hair natural, and it touched me so deeply. And she's the one that I started having really conversations around how difficult it was to inhabit some of my identities within the profession, and conversations also about socioeconomic status and class within graduate school programs, right? Several conversations of that nature. And then it all just culminated in an interaction with my sister. And this is where things absolutely shifted for me. So my sister is actually 11 years older than me. And she is a practicing psychologist or clinician in the Dominican Republic. And during my clinical training, she asked me to come into her group practice and in some ways provide a training around the APA ethics code.
Oh.
So if for those who might not be aware, right, a lot of Caribbean countries and other countries use the APA ethics code as their guiding ethics principles, but they might not have an overseeing body, right? We have the APA or state licensing boards or kind of hold us accountable in that way. That doesn't always exist in other countries. And I know that there's been a big movement to the Caribbean. There's organizations that have been very much developing an ethics code and an organization, right, that is based out of the Caribbean. To my current knowledge, that hasn't been fully established. So, right, this happened about 8 years ago that my sister asked me to come in for this training. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable because I was still doing my own training. But we kind of decided, right, like, I'm your sister, let's go ahead and do it. You can just share what you know. And I did. And it was kind of this dual experience of, within this group practice, people who'd been clinicians for, let's say average over 10 years, were looking at me as the expert because I am being trained in the United States.
Ooh.
And I was looking at them, is this what's happening in here? Like, without a governing body, like, these are things that you're not, required to do. And I left there and I had, I was uncomfortable, and how I was so easily judging that felt like it was representing what happens here, an enactment of what happens in the United States, especially upon my own even arrival to the United States, that we have this perception of American excellence. And
Elitism.
Right.
We have the right idea. And it was an experience you went through. It was difficult because as you were describing that, I was also wondering, oh gosh, those clinicians, I feel terrible because they're under this guise, this illusion that the APA standard is somehow the all-knowing standard. Again, we're psychologists. We're here in the United States. I do believe in the APA standards. That being said, I did not know other countries were adopting that as a standard as opposed to creating their own standard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so I think you really hit it on the nail when you said a reenactment.
Mm-hmm. And it happened, it felt like it happened so easily and so naturally. And I think that that's when things, as I was kind of parsing out what my experience of that interaction had been, I really had to contend with, right, this is what I've internalized about our own education system.
Yeah, it's interesting because we are essentially absorbed into these forces that, like you said, it was just so easy, you fell into it, because there are certain forces that we are a part of and we don't even realize it.
Right.
Yeah.
It really emphasized for me, right? I think that liberation psychology, I think I might have said this before, but it really teaches you to question everything, right? From what you've been taught to how you've been socialized towards yourself and other people. And I think that those experiences, right, and especially them happening kind of back to back in graduate school, really kind of took me on this journey of exploring my ancestry, exploring my own connections to land, exploring who I really want to be as a therapist and how I can integrate all of these parts of my identities into being a psychologist. And it culminated to some extent, right, in that paper, Decolonizing My Therapeutic Identity, where also I felt like it was a product of wanting to exemplify how, as a BIPOC identified person, I delved into questioning all of these things and exemplify how our internalized racism can propagate socialization toward anti-Blackness as well. And it cause harm to our BIPOC community and to ourselves, but more specific to our Black and Afro-Latinx siblings. And of course, we do this as a product of how our society is set up.
Dr. Báez-Powell, thank you so much for sharing these ideas as well as your deep personal experience and how you got into this work. Do you have any final thoughts?
I've been super honored to be able to come on your podcast and speak on this platform, especially as an early career psychologist. That feels really exciting and energizing. I think the final thoughts are around Promoting a move in training and education towards integrating liberation psychology into the various dominant approaches that exist to therapy in the United States, especially when considering the importance of what we are living through collectively. It's super important to do our own work as BIPOC community to be able to show up collectively. I will say, I know that there's been a lot of energy around the new book, Decolonizing Therapy, that came out, I believe, in November by Jennifer Mullen. It is something that I'm advocating for people to go out and buy. I think that they also have a beautiful way of, guiding through all of the questions that you might be able to ask yourself in doing this work, and how fortunate that the literature is expanding in this way.
Yeah, I will definitely include that in the show notes. And how can we support you?
I think supporting each other collectively feels really important, right? Like if we are all doing this work, then we are all making space for each other and what's to come after us. So, really bringing this into training and education and supervision, which is such a big part of training, that feels super important so that we can really have these deep conversations and, validate for each other's realities and humanize ourselves and our capacities to show up and really reinforce that collective healing and resilience that's so beautiful to see.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Báez-Powell, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color in Psychology. Other ways to support us include registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. We value your input and appreciate your continued support. You can send us an email, a message on LinkedIn, or send a voice message on our website. Until next time, I am your host, Jack Sun.